December 3, 1945. Snow fell over the Rhine Valley like ashes over a memory too heavy to bury. The war had been over for 7 months, but peace, as it turned out, had a slower train to catch. On the western edge of Germany, between the ruins of Koblenz and the frozen banks of the river, a U.S. internment camp stretched like a field of ghosts. Barbed wire cut across the landscape, its frost shining silver under a pale, pitiless sky. Inside, a group of women, former auxiliaries of the defeated Reich, huddled together, their uniforms stiff with dirt and despair. No one had eaten properly for a week. The soldiers guarding them were young and tired. Some smoked, others kicked the snow just to feel something other than boredom. Most had come expecting dangerous prisoners, fanatical Nazi nurses, loyal to the last breath. What they found instead were hollow cheeks, trembling hands, and eyes that no longer looked up. The contrast was uncomfortable, like walking into a battlefield expecting bullets and finding silence instead. From the guard tower, Sergeant William Will Harlan squinted through the swirling snow. 26, Kentucky-born and shaped by both tobacco fields and 2 years of war, he had seen hunger before, but never this kind. Combat had taught him how men starve with pride. This was different. This was the hunger of people who'd been stripped of every purpose, even the dignity of being an enemy. Below him, one of the women stumbled as she tried to lift a rusted tin bucket of water. Her name was Liesel Voigt, though no one here used names anymore. She had served as a Red Cross nurse attached to the Luftwaffe, technically not a combatant but captured nonetheless. She wore what was left of a gray uniform, patched and filthy, her collar marked with frostbite. In another life, she might have been beautiful. Now, her skin was the color of candle wax, and her lips were cracked until they bled. The camp's routine had settled into something mechanical. Roll call, shovel snow, wait for food that never came. The Americans were short on rations themselves, or so they said. The official paperwork called the prisoners disarmed enemy personnel, not POWs, a small bureaucratic miracle that allowed supplies to be cut without violating the Geneva Convention. The hunger was not deliberate, not exactly. It was the kind born of systems breaking down, of warehouses misplaced, of empathy lost in translation. By the 7th day, the smell of hunger became something real, a mixture of old snow, unwashed wool, and the faint metallic tang of desperation. The women no longer stood straight during inspection. They leaned on each other, sharing body heat in silence. A U.S. private passing by muttered, "Guess they ain't so tough now." Another laughed, his breath steaming in the cold. The comment wasn't cruel by intention, just detached, the kind of humor soldiers used to keep the frost from getting into their conscience. Will didn't laugh. He lit a cigarette and watched the smoke curl into the gray morning. "They'll be dead before Christmas if this keeps up," he murmured, mostly to himself. His superior, Lieutenant Harris, shrugged. "Orders are orders, Sergeant. The supply trucks are delayed. They'll manage." Harris was 23, his boots still clean, his voice still sure. Will had lost the energy to argue with confidence that young. At noon, the snow stopped falling. For a brief moment, sunlight cut through the clouds, pale and thin, revealing the camp in full, mud paths frozen into ridges, tents sagging under frost, women's shadows stretching long and fragile. Someone coughed hard enough to draw blood. Another woman, too weak to stand, slid down against the fence post. The barbed wire behind her glinted cruelly, a crown of thorns for a soldier's conscience. From the guard tower, Will saw it all and remembered a farm in Kentucky, his mother feeding strays from the back porch. She used to say, "The Lord tests a man not by what he can shoot, but by what he can feed." He shook his head, exhaling smoke. The war had been meant to prove something, to stop cruelty, not to practice it under new flags. The camp doctor, an overworked medic from Boston, came by that afternoon with a clipboard and no medicine. "We've logged 14 cases of fainting for a frostbite," he said. "But they're not dying. Not yet." Will frowned. "Not yet sounds a lot like soon." The doctor didn't reply. He just wrote something down and left, boots crunching over the snow like punctuation marks. At dusk, A convoy of American soldiers passed outside the perimeter. Jeeps loaded with canned goods headed to a nearby town for occupation troops. The prisoners watched silently as the engines rumbled past. One of the women, maybe Liesel, whispered something under her breath in German. A prayer, perhaps, or a curse. A can of peaches rolled off a jeep and landed in the snow just beyond the fence. Every head turned toward it. For a long moment, no one moved. Then a young guard, Private Collins, laughed and picked it up. "Guess it's mine now," he said, tossing it in the air. Liesel's gaze followed it like a cat following light. The phrase "mine now" hung in the air, half a joke, half a claim of power. Will looked at her, then at Collins, and something twisted quietly inside him. That night, the temperature dropped below freezing. The women curled up in their tents, rationing scraps of stale bread that wouldn't have fed a bird. Will paced near the fence, his breath fogging in the air. He wasn't supposed to approach prisoners without reason, but rules felt small against the sight of a camp slowly turning into a graveyard. From the shadows, a faint voice called out, "Her? Soldat." He turned. It was Liesel. She stood just close enough that her breath made clouds through the wire. She didn't ask for anything at first. She just stared, unblinking, holding a tin cup. Will could see her fingers trembling. He pulled out his cigarette pack, only two left, and passed one through the wire. She hesitated, then took it. Her lips quivered as she tried to light it with shaking hands. The match broke. He lit it for her, the flame catching the brief outline of her face, hollow but still alive. She inhaled once, coughed hard, then almost smiled. "It tastes like America," she said in broken English. Will let out a small, surprised laugh. "That bad, huh?" She didn't answer. The moment held, brief and human, before duty returned like a cold wind. From the tower, another guard shouted, "Harlan, you feeding them now?" He ignored it. The sound of laughter faded quickly into the dark. The next morning, frost coated everything, the tents, the rifles, even the barbed wire. The hunger had dulled faces into masks. One of the women fainted during roll call, her body folding like paper. Will stepped forward instinctively, but Harris barked, "Leave her. They'll pick her up." Will froze. Orders were orders. The woman lay still, snow gathering in her hair until she looked more like a statue than a person. Hours passed. The trucks didn't come. Will stood by the fence, jaw clenched, watching the weak shuffle toward the water barrels. He didn't know her name yet, but he recognized her by the way she still helped others stand. Liesel moved slower than before, her collar torn, her breath shallow. When she reached the fence, she looked up, and for a moment he thought she might speak again. Instead, she simply pressed her palm to the wire. He hesitated, then pressed his hand to the same spot on the other side. The metal was cold enough to burn through his glove. A plane passed overhead, breaking the silence. Somewhere beyond the clouds, America was already forgetting this place. When he looked down again, she was gone, back into the line of shadows that moved like ghosts through the snow. That evening, Will walked into the supply shed. The crates were nearly empty, one box of canned fruit, one of crackers meant for officers. He picked up a tin of peaches, stared at it for a long time, then slipped it into his coat pocket. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of coughing and muffled prayers. He told himself it was just one can, just one. But when he stepped out into the night, his hand shook, not from the cold, but from something heavier. He walked to the fence, where the snow reflected the moonlight like glass, and waited until the guards on rotation passed by. In the distance, he saw her silhouette again. She hesitated when he called softly, then stepped forward. He tossed the can gently through the wire. It landed in the snow at her feet. She froze, then looked up at him with something like disbelief. He almost smiled. "You're mine now," he said quietly, half a joke, half a confession to no one in particular. But as she picked up the can with trembling hands, the weight of the words sank deeper than he meant them to. And somewhere in the stillness of that frozen camp, the line between enemy and human began to thaw. The snow had not stopped since that night. It came down in long, whispering veils, smoothing the edges of the camp until even the fences looked softened. By morning, the footprints were gone. Only the memory of movement remained, like faint ghosts pressed into the white. Sergeant William Harlan was still awake when the first trumpet sounded for roll call. He hadn't slept. The guilt of that tin can burned hotter in his mind than the frost on his fingers. He told himself it didn't matter. One can of peaches wouldn't change the war. But when he saw her again, the woman who'd taken it, his certainty began to dissolve. She stood straighter that morning. Her cheeks were still hollow, but there was color now, the faintest blush of survival. Her eyes flicked toward him only once, as if to ask whether kindness was something she was allowed to acknowledge. He looked away first. Soldiers weren't supposed to be noticed by prisoners, not like that. Lieutenant Harris was late that day, a thin man with the authority of paperwork rather than presence. When he finally arrived, he announced that supplies were delayed another 48 hours. His tone was flat, bureaucratic, as though he were discussing train schedules. "We're not to engage the prisoners," he said. "Keep order. No contact. And for God's sake, stop playing the Samaritan, Harlan. We're soldiers, not social workers." The men laughed. Will didn't. His jaw tightened around the cold air. The fence behind him hissed softly as wind slipped through the barbs. For a moment he wondered if mercy had an expiration date, or if it just got buried under snow and orders. By noon, the women were set to work clearing paths for the next supply convoy. The guards watched, rifles slung, bored and restless. Liesel, he finally learned her name from a confiscated tag, moved slower than most, her thin gloves soaked through. When she stumbled, the guard nearest her shouted, "Up, Fräulein! You think this is a hotel?" His voice cracked against the stillness, harsh and unnecessary. She didn't respond. She just kept working, shoulders trembling. Will looked away, but the sound of the guards' laughter lingered. It was the kind of laughter men used when they wanted to remind themselves they were in control. He had used it once himself, long ago, when he'd been younger and scared of pity. That afternoon, as the snow turned to sleet, Will found himself pacing near the outer perimeter again. The fence looked harmless now, the barbs crusted with ice, more decoration than danger. He saw her there, crouched low, repairing a torn section of canvas near the fence line. When she rose, her knees buckled. Before he could think, he was beside her, steadying her through the wire. She froze, eyes wide with the kind of fear that no longer expected rescue. Then, softly, she said in fractured English, "You shouldn't." Her breath clouded between them like confession smoke. "Neither should you," he replied. "But here we are." It wasn't flirtation, not even comfort. It was something rawer, a recognition that both were trapped in a story neither had chosen. He took out another cigarette, the last one, and slipped it through the wire. This time she didn't hesitate. When the match flared, their faces glowed briefly, two figures caught in the same fragile light. He found out later that Harris had been watching. That evening, the lieutenant summoned him to the command tent. "You've got a bleeding heart, Sergeant," he said, voice casual but cold. "That's dangerous in a place like this. The rules are there for a reason." Will stood stiff. "She's starving, sir. They all are. You can't fight ideals on an empty stomach." Harris gave a thin smile. "That's exactly how we fought them for 6 years." He paused, studying him. "You've done your duty well, Harlan. Don't ruin it by falling for your own humanity." Outside, the night wind carried the smell of kerosene and burned coffee. Will walked back to his post, each step heavy with something he couldn't name. He'd followed every order through the war. Shot when told, marched when told, survived when told. But no one had prepared him for the command to look away. He stayed by the fence longer each day, not speaking, just standing there, as if his presence alone could keep the camp from collapsing into silence. The other guards started calling him the priest. Private Collins joked that he should start hearing confessions. "She'll tell you her sins," Collins said, "and you'll hand out rations instead of forgiveness." The laughter stung, but Will said nothing. 3 days passed. The supply trucks still hadn't arrived. The women grew weaker, Even the officers began cutting their own rations. The medic came again with his clipboard, shaking his head. They're down to 500 calories a day. Some haven't stood in two. Will followed him out of the tent, voice low. What happens if they start dying? The medic shrugged, lighting a cigarette. Then command will call it unfortunate. Paperwork will fix it faster than we can. The next morning Will brought bread from the officer's mess. It wasn't much, a crust wrapped in a handkerchief, but to her, it might as well have been gold. He left it by the wire, no words exchanged. When he returned that night, the cloth was gone. In its place was something unexpected. A small scrap of paper folded 3 times. He opened it. The handwriting was careful, almost elegant. The German words halting but clear. Danke, Verbrot, Versailles, Michigan. Thank you, for the bread, for seeing me. He folded it carefully, tucking it inside his jacket like contraband memory. For the first time since the war ended, something inside him stirred. A strange mix of shame and tenderness. Harris noticed the change. During inspection, he muttered, "You've gone soft, Harlan. These women were part of the machine that killed good men. Don't start thinking they're saints because they cry pretty." Will didn't argue, but later, as he looked across the fence at those shivering figures, he thought of his mother again. The way she'd said mercy wasn't weakness, it was proof you still had something left worth defending. On the 5th day, the snow turned to mud. The prisoners were told to move debris from a collapsed barack. One woman collapsed mid-task. Harris ordered the guards to drag her aside. "We'll deal with her later." Will knelt down instead, his coat brushing the mud. Her pulse fluttered weakly under his fingers. "She's still breathing," he said. Harris frowned. "Not your problem, Sergeant." But Will didn't move. He lifted her with quiet efficiency, carrying her to the medical tent. No one stopped him this time. Perhaps they were too tired to care. That night, Harris called him again. "You're pushing it, Harlan. Keep this up and you'll be reassigned. You understand?" Will nodded, though he didn't. Reassigned to where? The war was over. The real battles were quieter now, fought in the thin spaces between compassion and command. He went back to his post by the fence. She was there, waiting in the dim light of the moon. He didn't speak, didn't need to. She pressed her fingers to the wire again, and this time he didn't hesitate. He took her hand through the metal, the cold biting both their skins. It wasn't affection, it was proof of life. Far off, a radio crackled in the officer's tent. A voice announced that the first relief convoy was expected within days. Supplies, warm food, the end of this frozen purgatory. Will exhaled, slow and shaky, his breath mingling with hers through the fence. When he returned to his barack, Harris was waiting, arms crossed. "You'll be on night rotation tomorrow. Alone. Think of it as a test of loyalty." Will said nothing, but as he lay on his cot, the words "your mind" now echoed in his mind. Not as dominance, but as responsibility. He had crossed an invisible line, one that couldn't be undone. By dawn, the snow had turned to slush, and the sky glowed the color of lead. The camp was silent except for the hum of wind against the wires. Will lit his last cigarette, staring out across the frostbitten field. On the other side, Liesel appeared again, holding the empty can he'd once given her. She placed it on the ground between them, then turned away before he could speak. He watched as she disappeared into the fog, her figure fading like memory itself. Behind him, Harris's voice broke the silence. "She won't be your problem much longer, Harlan. Orders came in this morning." Will turned. "What orders?" Harris smiled thinly. "Transfers. They're moving that group out tomorrow. Destination not specified." He paused, buttoning his coat. "You see, Sergeant? The system takes care of itself." The lieutenant walked away, boots splashing through the mud. Will stood by the fence long after he was gone, the echo of his words heavy in the air. The camp lights flickered once, dimmed, then steadied. Somewhere in the distance, a truck engine started. And for the first time, Will realized that the fence he'd been standing beside wasn't just theirs anymore. It was his too. The snowstorm began without warning. By the second night, the road to Koblenz was gone, swallowed by white silence and drifting wind. The command tents lost their signals first, then the telegraph lines, then their patience. The lieutenant cursed the weather and retreated to the officer's hut, leaving Sergeant William Harlan in charge of the camp. The decision wasn't formal, it just happened the way fatigue makes choices for men. Orders stopped arriving. The last convoy had not returned. The camp became a forgotten island in the middle of winter. The first day without orders felt strangely peaceful. No yelling, no new lists, no clipped voices demanding obedience. Just snow, falling so thick it softened the sound of boots. Will made his rounds, clipboard in hand, though there was little to record. The prisoners stayed in their tents, conserving energy. Even the guards spoke less, their cigarettes burning faster than usual. Hunger had made everyone gentle in a cruel kind of way. By the third day, rations ran out entirely. The kitchen fire died to embers. Soldiers gnawed old biscuits. Prisoners boiled snow for soup. The air inside the camp smelled faintly of smoke and wet wool. The medic stopped writing reports, he had nothing left to measure. Men wandered the perimeter with blank expressions, as if waiting for instructions that would never come. Will watched it all from the tower, his breath fogging the glass. Somewhere below, Liesel was still alive. He could spot her easily now. She wore a red scarf someone had tied around her neck, a strip torn from an old flag. She moved slower, but she still moved. She helped others up when they fell. He noticed that about her. Even starving, she carried herself like she owed the world something gentle. On the fourth morning, a guard named Collins came to Will with a complaint. They stole bread from the officer's stock, he said. One of the women. I saw her near the crates. Will followed him to the shed, where a small piece of crust was missing from a box. Hardly enough to feed a sparrow. You sure you saw her? Will asked. Collins shrugged. Does it matter? They're all the same now. If we let them steal, we lose control. Control. The word sat heavy on Will's tongue. Control had already gone with the storm. The radios were dead. The supply trucks were buried. He looked at Collins, whose hands were shaking more from fear than cold. If we start punishing hunger, Will said quietly, we'll have to shoot half the camp, including ourselves. Collins frowned but didn't argue. When he left, Will slipped a piece of his own ration, a single cracker, into the prisoner's crate. A small rebellion against indifference. That night, the wind changed direction. It carried the smell of thawing mud and something metallic like rust or blood. Will walked the perimeter alone. The floodlights flickered, barely cutting through the snow. On the other side of the wire, shadows huddled together for warmth. He could hear whispers in German, soft and rhythmic, maybe prayer or memory. He didn't know which was worse. He stopped when he saw her. Liesel stood by the fence again, scarf pulled tight, her hands bare. She wasn't begging this time. She was simply there, watching him as if waiting for proof he still existed. He reached into his coat and pulled out a tin, his last one, labeled U.S. Army Beans, 1944. He rolled it under the wire. She caught it clumsily, nodding once in thanks. He didn't tell anyone. In war, silence was its own kind of mercy. By the fifth day, 2 prisoners had died. The medic covered their faces with scraps of cloth and moved on. There were no coffins, no ceremony. The ground was too hard to dig. The guards grew restless, some angry, others numb. Will gathered them by the gate. We keep routine, he said. We do roll call, we maintain watch, we wait for orders. Harris would have barked it as command. Will said it as prayer. Collins muttered. Orders from who? God. Nobody laughed. The storm had made believers of them all. Later that evening, Will sat in the command hut, the oil lamp flickering. He opened the logbook and began writing, not orders but names. Every prisoner he could recall, every face that had passed through the camp. He didn't know why. Maybe to remind himself they weren't statistics. Maybe so that when this was over, someone would remember. He wrote for hours until his hand cramped, the ink freezing mid-sentence. Outside, the snow stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm. He stepped out, pulling his coat tight. The world had turned to glass, frozen branches, glittering fences, even the air sharp enough to cut. The prisoners were awake, staring toward the main gate. Something had appeared at the edge of the camp. A lone horse cart, half buried in snow, covered with canvas. Will approached cautiously, rifle slung low. The driver was dead, frozen in place, his eyes open to the night. Under the tarp, boxes marked with faded stencils, U.S. Medical Corps. He pried one open, bandages, quinine, tins of food. Enough to last a few days if rationed carefully. He dragged the boxes back toward the camp. The guards gathered around, their faces pale with disbelief. "Where'd you find that?" Collins asked. Will looked toward the horizon. "Does it matter?" He divided the supplies without speaking. One part for the soldiers, one for the prisoners. No one protested. Hunger had made them all equal now. When the food reached the women's tents, a faint murmur spread through the air, something between sobbing and laughter. Will felt it vibrate through the snow, through the wire, through his chest. He stood there until the sound faded, replaced by quiet chewing, the smallest proof of life returning. That night he returned to the fence. She was waiting again, the tin he'd given her empty, polished clean. She held it up, showing him like a promise. He smiled faintly, nodding toward the tents. "There'll be more tomorrow," he said. She hesitated, then whispered, "You are Captain?" He shook his head. "Just the fool who stayed too long by the fence." She almost laughed. It was a broken sound, but real. Then her expression changed, eyes flicking past him. He turned. A light had appeared on the ridge, small, distant, flickering red. A signal flare. He raised his binoculars. The snow distorted everything, but he could just make out the silhouette of vehicles moving, slow and heavy. Relief, perhaps, or inspection. The 6th day passed in anxious waiting. The prisoners were restless again, unsure whether salvation or punishment was coming. The guards cleaned rifles that hadn't fired in months. Will stood by the watchtower, scanning the road. Nothing yet, only the endless white horizon. That evening the medic approached him. "If those trucks are supply convoys, they'll want a record of who's still alive," he said. "Your list. Finish it." Will nodded. He spent the night writing again, the lamp flickering against the frost. His handwriting had grown shaky, the ink smudged by tired hands. He listed names until dawn, first names, last initials, then ages where he could remember them. The final page read simply, 78 remain. Condition poor but alive. On the 7th morning, the wind calmed. The air smelled different, warmer somehow, tinged with diesel and smoke. The distant rumble of engines grew louder. The camp stirred. Guards buttoned their coats. Prisoners rose from their tents. Will climbed the tower, heart pounding. Over the ridge came 3 trucks, U.S. markings dull beneath frost. Relief. Real this time. He exhaled, chest tightening with relief that felt like pain. The convoy slowed at the gate, men jumping down, shouting orders. The first crate unloaded was marked food, rations, Type C. For the first time in weeks, the air filled with the sound of metal cans opening, of spoons scraping tin. The medic cried openly. Even Harris, stepping out from the officer's hut, looked shaken. He glanced at Will, eyes narrowing. "Who authorized this distribution?" Will held up his notebook. "I did, in absence of orders." The lieutenant stared at him for a long moment. Then he took the book, scanning the pages. "You kept names. Someone had to." Harris closed the log slowly. "Then you'd better hope they match the records, Sergeant. Because this list," he tapped the cover. "This will be your responsibility now." Will met his gaze. It already was. By nightfall, the storm was gone. Fires burned in barrels, warming hands that had forgotten heat. Somewhere near the fence, faint singing rose. A tune with no words, carried by tired voices. Will stood alone, the sound wrapping around him like smoke. The snow had begun to melt, revealing the earth underneath. Dark, wet, and alive again. He turned toward the horizon, where the convoy lights glowed like distant stars, and whispered into the cold air, 7 days. Behind him, a soldier approached quietly, holding a telegram just delivered through the relay truck. The paper trembled in the wind. "Message for you, Sergeant," the man said. Will unfolded it under the lantern. The ink was smeared, but one line stood clear. Reassignment effective immediately. Report to headquarters at dawn. He stared at it for a long time, the light flickering across his face. When he looked back toward the fence, she was there again, framed in the silver of moonlit snow, watching him as if she already knew he wouldn't stay. The convoy left as quietly as it had come, its tracks already filling with melting snow. The camp was no longer starving, but something else, something quieter, had taken its place. The soldiers moved slower, as if unsure what to do without hunger driving them. Even laughter, when it returned, felt foreign. Sergeant William Harlan stood by the gate, watching the last truck disappear over the ridge, his reassignment orders folded in his pocket like a secret he didn't want to read again. The women were lined up for transfer, their belongings bundled in gray cloth, their faces cleaner but still wary. Among them, Liesel stood near the end of the line, scarf gone, hair cut short. She looked thinner than before, yet her eyes held a strange calm, the kind that comes after surviving something you can't yet name. Will wanted to speak to her, but the camp was full of officers now. Inspectors, clerks, Red Cross delegates. Men with pens sharp enough to draw blood on paper. One of the officers, an American major, stopped near him. "You've done good work here, Sergeant," he said without warmth. "Kept order, kept records. That list you made will go to command. You'll be cited for efficiency." Will almost laughed. Efficiency. The word felt like a stranger in this place. He nodded instead, his gaze drifting past the major to the fence, now sagging under its own rust. Beyond it, the land stretched wide and empty, snow receding into brown earth. The war was ending everywhere else. Here it only felt paused. When the transfers began, Liesel looked up briefly, scanning the line of guards until her eyes found him. For a moment, neither moved. He wanted to step forward, to hand her something, to say something, but all he had were words he didn't trust anymore. The officer beside him barked an order, and she turned away, climbing into the truck without a backward glance. The engines started. The sound echoed off the hills like thunder with nowhere to go. Will stood until the last truck vanished into the fog. Around him, the camp emptied itself. Soldiers packed, tents came down, logs burned to ash. Only the wind remained, carrying the faint scent of oil, bread, and distance. By evening, his quarters were stripped bare. The cot creaked when he sat on it, the silence louder than any battle he'd fought. He unfolded the telegram again, its creases soft from too much handling. Report to headquarters at dawn. A new posting, a new beginning. But all he could think of was the way she'd looked through the wire that first night. Starving, defiant, human. He found himself walking toward the fence one last time. The snow there was patchy now, the ground muddy with footprints that would soon vanish. Near one of the posts, half buried in slush, something glinted. He knelt and brushed it free. A small tin can, the same one he'd thrown through the wire weeks ago. Cleaned, polished, its surface catching the dying light. Inside, folded carefully, was a scrap of paper. German words, written in a neat, deliberate hand. "We were seen. That is enough." He stood there for a long time, the wind tugging at his coat, the camp around him dissolving into dusk. The world beyond the fence had begun to move again. Trains, orders, new borders being drawn. But inside him, something refused to follow. When dawn came, he didn't wait for the escort. He left before the trucks arrived, walking toward the same road the prisoners had taken. The sky was turning gold, the first clean sunrise he'd seen in months. Each step crunched over frozen ground that was learning to breathe again. At the crest of the hill, he stopped and looked back. The camp lay below like a memory half erased. Fences broken, tents sagging, the flag on its pole fluttering weakly. For a moment it seemed peaceful, almost sacred. He reached into his coat, pulled out the tin, and set it down on a rock. Then he saluted, not to the flag, not to command, but to the silence that had followed mercy. When he turned away, the wind carried the faintest echo behind him, a voice or maybe just memory, soft, foreign, familiar. He didn't look back. The war had ended, but its aftertaste would follow him into every meal, every quiet room, every winter that came too early. As the sun broke over the horizon, he whispered into the cold, "After the bread, the silence." Then he walked on, the sound of his boots fading into the thawing world that no longer needed orders, only remembrance.